I suggest we move on to the next speaker. His name is Mark Manulis. He's a researcher at the University of Surrey. He's acting as the head of Department of Computer Science. He's published a couple of research papers on the vulnerabilities related to satellite constellations. So he fits in exactly for this afternoon. So we are delighted to welcome Mark. Mark, are you online and can you hear us?
Hi, Matthew. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me and see my slides?
We can hear you fine. Great. And we can see your slide. You're also using the fancy PowerPoint as a background. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, I think you're good. You're all set. Please go ahead for the presentation, and we'll talk to you for the Q&A after.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I'd like to thank Matthew and CYSAT for this opportunity, for invitation to come and talk to you about the security challenges for satellite constellations. And even though I will mention some ideas on how to address some of these challenges, the talk is really more about challenges and is supposed to, let's say, motivate further thinking and further research into this interesting area. New space is a kind of a new rising ecosystem, and I like this particular diagram. So that is a bit dated, but it kind of shows the different verticals of new space, of the future new space economy. And some of them, like space-based energy or space resources, they are more a vision at the moment than anything close to reality. But at the moment, we are kind of looking into the first verticals, which is about the spacecrafts and about the launch of this. And so one of the major elements in a new space economy will be satellite constellations. So these are constellations, so groups of typically small satellites, can be anything between, let's say, hundreds and thousands small satellites in an orbit. What characterizes them is that they're mostly built from commercial off-the-shelf components in both software and hardware. And also, there are many competing, let's say, companies who are developing their constellations. And so far, there has been no interoperability, and pretty much every company develops their own satellites and their own protocols and systems. And there is a very strong black box mentality there, which means possibly for protection of the IP, but it also means that it is harder for researchers to go actually and analyze the protocols for security researchers, for example. And there are a number of different constellations that already have satellites in orbit, and I'm sure you are familiar with this, like Starlink, which has over 1,000 satellites in orbit, or OneWeb, which was at the brink of bankruptcy, but received a major financial investment and has 140 satellites in orbit. Planet Labs, which maintains 2 constellations, and the Hawkeye, another player in this field. So these constellations are expected to have 67% of all satellites in the future. So this is a chart on the right. Until the year 2028, there is a prediction that 67% of satellites in space will be part of constellations, and only 33% will be like standalone satellites. And of course, these constellations have a variety of different applications in mind to the developers of these constellations. And what is projected is that telecommunications is going to be by far the largest sector. So global broadband, like the ones offered by Starlink and OneWeb, is also aiming to achieve this global broadband service, but also a variety of other applications. In geolocation services, of course, we all know about the Galileo, but for instance, Hawkeye is also developing a constellation based on RF technology to provide some navigation services, particularly, for example, focusing on maritime sectors and so on. And of course, Earth observation, so satellite imagery, is another big application of constellations. as well as signal intelligence. So there will be huge potential for constellations and a variety of applications and use cases. Now, in terms of the architectures, the new space has certain differences to the traditional space, right? So, but if we think about the mission, so like the typical phases of the mission, they're pretty much similar. So there is still a launch, there is a commissioning, there is in-service, and there is end of life. However, in terms of new space, in terms of constellations, there are some differences on to how this mission phases will work. And in particular for launch, if we talk about small satellites, then typically the launch will include a batch of small satellites at the same time, so in one start. And what is typically happening is that this launch might be shared with other companies. So not only satellites from one company will be launched at the same time, but also from other companies. And that, of course, poses also some additional security risks, which I'll talk about a bit later. When it comes to the in-service, the constellations, they will be typically involved in different missions. So these are commercial constellations that will take, let's say, requests from their clients and offer the service. For example, imagery. They might have a request from different clients for different observation missions. So a constellation will be involved in different missions. And what will happen is also that the constellation will has a not all satellites go straight away into the orbit. So the constellation is typically built up sequentially, which means that the developers need to consider the dynamic changes to the constellation. So new satellites coming into the constellation, but also all satellites retiring from the constellation. And then there is also end of life, and end of life is kind of similar to traditional space, old space. Now, when it comes to the segments, so in the space segment, as I already said, most satellites are based on commodity off-the-shelf software and hardware, so like Linux operating systems. We see prevalent use of systems on chips, so like the one picture on just behind me. This is a Xilinx chip, so it's an ARM processor with FPGA support. So these are the similar chips that are used in other IoT devices. And so obviously there are also some issues with regard to security, some threats there. But what we also see is the increasing use of the software-defined radios. So they provide a very flexible way of basically enabling the communication at the lower layers, so the physical data link layer. And these are cheap, let's say, units that people can buy and also attackers can buy, right? And in the space segment, when it comes to constellation, what main difference is caused by inter-satellite links, right? So the ability for satellites to communicate with each other without the necessity to send the messages down to the Earth and then back up to another satellite again. And there are various technologies for this, RF technologies, but also optical links are being considered. When it comes to the ground segment, and we've heard a number of talks in this workshop earlier, there is a clear trend to a cloud-based solution. Now, in case of satellite constellations, your ground station needs to be distributed. So you need to span a geographic area. So you need to have multiple stations that can possibly be controlled through a centralized cloud infrastructure. But the cloud infrastructure, of course, brings challenges from the security point of view. And also on the user segment, there will be a more increased web access to the satellite, to the data, satellite's data, as well as the satellite services. And in the future, we may expect that some user segment, so some customer terminals will be able to communicate directly to the satellites. So that might be possible as well if you think about the future infrastructure with regard to smart cities and the vehicles and so forth. So what we have covered in our article, which appeared in May, it's an open source article, so it's a cooperation with our Surrey Space Centre with some funding support from NCC Group and also a National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK. So in that paper, we try to address the different challenges and opportunities with regard to cybersecurity in new space. It's an open access paper, so you can read it. You don't need to subscribe to anything. And since publication, it has been accessed over 9,500 times, which shows the interest. And as part of that work, we also looked into the historical, we did some historical analysis. So we looked at the publicly available information about incidents related to security in relation to space. So this talk is loosely based on that article. So what we have discovered is, of course, it's I kind of expected that over the time we see exponential increase in the number of operational satellites. So that's the figure on the left side, the red line. And then similarly, the number of satellite incidents related to security has also followed the same exponential growth. So this is not surprising. And what we also looked at, we wanted to understand what are the typical attacks, their frequency, and the motivation. So this is the chart on the right, which basically looks at it through three different dimensions. So the number of incidents. On the x-axis, you can see the motivation. So in terms of motivation, you can see that the majority are state espionage as well as politically motivated crimes. So they prevail. But then in terms of the techniques, this is the color coding on this chart. The top kind of technique for attacking is the common network exploitation. And this is not surprising because clearly, if you want to attack a satellite, you would typically attack the ground station and then through the ground station create harm to the satellite, to the service. And with the use of cloud-based services, we can expect that the CNE will remain the top kind of attack. And there is jamming, and jamming is about the RF signal. It's a denial of service attack. So obviously, constellations want to protect their service, so some anti-jamming mechanisms will need to be in place. And the third one was the hijacking of satellite that could be also done through a combination of different techniques. We also try to look what are the protocols out there, and in particular, are there any standards? And so we found this set of protocol of standards, so-called blue books, published by a consultative committee for space data systems, so CCSDS. And what they try to do basically is to create some standards for lower layer protocols, so physical layer and data link layer, such that at the higher levels, a typical IP set of protocols could be used, right? And if you have support for IP suites, then you can use possibly commodity protocols at the IP layer, including security protocols at the IP layer, such as IPsec. Well, subject, of course, to performance issues there. But in terms of the standards, they have defined two sets of protocols. So the Proximity 1 Spacelink protocol from 2013 that was updated in 2020. And it is a protocol for short-range bidirectional mobile radio links. And they specifically say that it is also suitable for orbiting constellations. Now, that protocol includes physical as well as the data link protocol, but it doesn't include any security. So they clearly say that security is supposed to be provided at other layers. So the second set of protocols is the space data link protocols. And these are protocols to basically enable TT&C communication. And these protocols were kind of designed with security in mind because where security is supposed to be provided through additional header. And this header is described in the Space Data Link Security Protocol, which was published first 2015 and updated last year. And in that protocol, there is a clear provision for authentication and encryption, as well as the set of recommended cryptographic algorithms to achieve this property. But also, they have provision for the managing of keys like over-the-air rekeying and so on, security associations, as well as the control channel for maintaining this data link security protocol. In terms of cryptographic algorithms, if you look at the recommendations, then they are quite up to date. And indeed, we're using AES with 256 bits in GCM mode, and GCM mode is good because it provides the functionality of AEID, which is the authenticated encryption with associated data, meaning you can authenticate your header, for example, and at the same time encrypt and authenticate the payload. Also on the message authentication, we're using HMAC with SHA-256, as well as we have provision for digital signatures with quite long keys, 4,000-bit keys. And since we're using digital signatures, we also have a provision for credentials like certificates. But in that recommendation with regard to authentication credentials, there is also a mention of protected simple authentication, which essentially means passwords. And I think that we have enough problems with passwords here down on Earth, so we do not necessarily need to bring them further up in space. We also looked into the Cubesat space protocol, which was designed in 2013 and kind of released in 2020. That protocol is a lightweight protocol and was designed to work with 32-bit ARM microcontrollers, but the crypto provided in that protocol, I would say, is currently weak. So I wouldn't recommend using that protocol, in particular 128 bits for keys because of the use of the XT block cipher, but also the SHA-1 hash function is not considered the first choice today. We know also about the Galileo's way to authenticate the navigation messages, and I think it's a quite interesting concept that they have adopted there. It is authenticating the navigation messages. It is not directly authenticated with range measurements, so it's not fully sufficient for positioning, velocity, and timing. However, the protection, for example, against replay attacks is not part of the standard. It is left to receiver implementations, and so some ideas are provided on how to do that. The protocol itself is based on a quite old and well-known approach called Tesla, which essentially uses hash chains and miracle trees. So an example of a miracle tree you see on the right here, that create symmetric keys, and they are chained together, and the authentication is done through a delayed approach. So first you send the MAC, and then later you send the key, and you kind of verify the MAC that you received before with the key that you received later. And the keys are chained. So this reduces the overhead. However, we still need digital signatures to broadcast, let's say, the root of this miracle tree. And for this, they use ECDSA. The hashing provision is strong. It's SHA-256, but they also have made provision to use SHA-3 standard. And so that's a kind of very interesting approach, especially because it comes with cross-authentication. Now, cross-authentication means that not each satellite sends authenticated messages. You have a subset of satellites that will send authenticated messages for other satellites. So one satellite, for instance, can authenticate messages that are sent by several other satellites. Now, this doesn't necessarily improve security because that it introduces additional trust assumption on that satellite, but it improves performance and also reliability. So in terms of the challenges with regard to crypto keys, and of course you need crypto keys in order to be able to use crypto. Well, first, there are only a handful locations where you launch satellites. So the question is, when do you rekey the satellite? So what's the right time to key the satellite? And in case of large satellites, typically you have a crypto unit, a dedicated crypto unit that you transfer to the launch facility and eventually plug in. In case of small satellites, that doesn't work like that, because with small satellites, we don't have typically such dedicated crypto units. It's system on chip. So you need to worry about keying the satellite and then ensuring that it was not compromised before we launch. While in service, the questions are about rekeying satellites as well as updating algorithms, for example, updating crypto algorithms. So obviously you need a way to validate these update messages. And so you also, in case of in-service, so when the satellite is in space, you might need to worry about radiation as well. So for example, if the keys with some bits and the keys are flipped because of this radiation events, then maybe your keys will become unusable. So you need to have some kind of backing up, and maybe using fault-tolerant cryptography could help to achieve that vision. End of life is somewhat easier in terms of long-term confidentiality. So small satellites will burn upon re-entry, which means that physical recovery of keys is not an issue. However, what is an issue is the use of cryptography. And as you know, publicly cryptography will eventually be broken by quantum computers. And so post-quantum cryptography is clearly on the rise, and there is ongoing NIST competition going on. So I think that it is useful to look at that, to start planning for future missions using post-quantum crypto, for example. Symmetric cryptography is fine, just that the keys need to be double long in order to still have protection against quantum computers. I think what will happen is increasing use of trusted hardware, trusted computing in space, because trusted computing seems to be the solution for keying the satellite, because it was designed to provide tamper-resistant storage as well as some processing if the system is deployed at some adversarial, let's say, environment. So I think we will see a rise of trusted computing technologies, and there are various approaches there. So there is a TCG and the TPMs, but also more increasingly there are TEEs, so trusted execution environments, that provide essentially you the facility to create two worlds, if you want, a secure world where you can run your highly sensitive processes as well as the normal world, and they can interact as well. So I believe this will be we will see increasing use of trusted computing in case of satellite constellations. So in terms of a key establishment, so when the satellites are in the orbit, they need to communicate. So the ground to satellite can typically be done using pre-deployed keys, either symmetric or asymmetric. But it's a good practice in crypto to refresh keys for different sessions. So session is something abstract. It can be a period in time. It can be for duration of a mission. But nevertheless, what you want to have is to be able to establish session keys. And there are two approaches there. One is a key exchange, like, for example, Diffie-Hellman, which doesn't require any secure channels in place. And the other one is encrypted key transport, where you send the key over a secure channel. So the secure channel needs to be in place. Now, key transport is not a good approach. And essentially, if you followed TLS specification 1.3, they removed all the key transport cipher suites from TLS. So key exchange is essentially the better way to go. And for example, IPsec for satellite communications enables key exchange functionality. The other approach are the quantum key distribution. The problem with quantum key distribution is that you still need an authentication channel. And so you would still need classical cryptographic keys to authenticate the messages. In case of satellite to satellite, what will become interesting is if inter-satellite links are used to establish channels. So a key exchange is again better here for better scalability, because you can't have pre-shared keys between different pairs of satellites in the orbit. That will not be manageable. But also quantum key distribution through, for example, optical links might be an interesting approach. There are further constellation-specific issues, such as with regard to scalability, because typically you want to have separate keys to protect separate type of messages like PTNC or payload and so on, as well as due to the distributed nature, there are challenges associated with the key management on the ground station. Because if it's not a centralized, it's a distributed ground station, you should be able to manage keys such that you can communicate with same satellites from different ground stations securely. And and then other kind of issues that arise, the lightweight cryptography. So the smaller the satellite is, maybe you want to look at some lightweight crypto primitives, but also group dynamics, right? Because addition, removal of satellites, it has implication on the key management and on the secure channels between the satellites. In case of fault tolerance, again, cryptography can help because cryptography has these techniques like secret sharing or threshold cryptography that are designed to provide some fault tolerance for your crypto without relying on other methods like error correction codes and so on.
Please wrap up, Mark, because the time is running.
Yes, and finally, just with three points. So secure positioning. So obviously, what is interesting is to look at whether the inter-satellite links somehow can help in ranging satellites. And if you have a secure ranging facility, then you can also have a secure positioning facility. And if you have a secure positioning facility, then maybe you can use it to actually identify and verify the satellite, because it might become an additional authentication factor, the position of the satellite. If ISLs are used, then probably packets will have to be forwarded through the constellation using ISLs, and this might call for new routing protocols, dynamic routing protocols, because setting routes from ground stations may not always be efficient or scalable. And finally, mission privacy. It's not about hiding the satellite, because you can't really hide a satellite in space, but it's more about protecting your constellation, your mission from third-party intelligence gathering. And so encryption might help for the payload, but if you power up a satellite at a particular location each time, then this might reveal something about the mission. So what are the methods where you can achieve some privacy with regard to the missions?
Mark, I'm really sorry. We really need to wrap up.
Sorry. So basically, that's my last slide. So here at Surrey, we are currently building a constellation testbed using FTCs and SDRs. And we want to use this testbed to try and analyze space security and networking protocols. And we are open to collaboration. So thank you again, and sorry for taking a bit more time.
No, thank you. I saw my colleague Patrick nodding a lot during your talk. I think you touched on a lot of very relevant points. I've been working on security in space for 2 years now, and I think you covered very extensively all the technical points that need to be addressed. We do have a couple of questions, but we'll have to go very fast because we're already running a bit late. I have one question of, do you have any specific example of incidents happen in space involving constellations in your research? You mentioned that you mapped all the incidents. Is there any incident involving constellations?
Well, there are incidents with regard to the GPS. So if you think of the GPS as a constellation, then yes. But I mean, this research was done over a period and ended in 2019. This is when we submitted the paper. So since that, we haven't really followed it. But I don't think at that time there were any incidents relating to new constellations like Starlink or OneWeb.
Yeah. Also, one question from the chat, and I had the same in mind. This is sort of complicated. If you don't have any background in security, you do need to do a lot of research to understand all these concepts. You talked about trusted execution environment, all the keys, the crypto, and so on and so on. It's really overwhelming. What would be your recommendation or your pragmatic advice for new space operators to implement concrete solutions? And the question in the chat was especially about tamper resistant and HSMs for small sats.
Okay, so the first part of the question, I mean, I would say you need to go and talk to a security expert. I mean, I wouldn't recommend anyone to try and understand security, because if you're a software developer, a hardware engineer, software engineer, you have your skills, so you need to
Yeah.
have to bring in a person who has the skills. And I believe that there are a lot of security researchers. I mean, we are open to cooperation as well. So but so it's not an issue to find security research, I think. In terms of the HSMs and trusted execution environments, I mean, if your satellites are using the system on chips, like the one I had on the slide from Xilinx, then they do have TEs already on board. So it's just a matter of looking into how to use it. And again, that's the skill, the knowledge that suitable security engineer would have.
Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, and I have just one question about, you explain a lot around the key for the IS algorithm and some other functionality of the key. 2 points maybe to add. For the key generation, you have some recommendation, and the second one is for the key rate. If you have a key rate of you generate a new key every second, and you use every second this key for encrypt, you will generate some complexity in the security. What are your recommendation about that?
For key generation, there are good standards so if you look for key derivation functions that allow you essentially to create a longer stream of bits for the key, something shorter like a seed. I know there are also companies that work on quantum random number generators, and this would also fit into that, for example. But in terms of session keys, so it doesn't have to be every second. So if you think about TLS connection to the server, well, it's valid for the duration of the session with the server, and then at some point it will be refreshed. So I think that's a parameter that is can be configured and selected depending on what is the notion of a session in this case.
Okay,
it can be refreshed on a daily basis, for example, or it can be refreshed each time the satellite comes into the vicinity of some ground station. So,
absolutely.
Thank you, Mark. I hope that your talk inspired some of the satellite operators that are among the participants to work with you and to deep dive into the security topic. On the final note, I can't prevent myself to not mention that I'll take my CYSAT hat, that we're developing Arcaspace, which is exactly addressing this issue of security on board. More information on the CYSAT website /space if you want to look up Arcaspace.